Okay, welcome back to the second half, the second and final half of MathDoctor.net, video number 201. Like I mentioned before, we have production values on some of these videos, and I had to cut that one off suddenly. We had just talked about the definitions of right angle, acute angle, obtuse angle, and straight angle. A right angle means simply a square corner, an angle that's 90 degrees. An acute angle is one that is sharp, less than 90 degrees. An obtuse angle, like that obtuse kid in your class, is not very sharp. It's more than 90 degrees, all the way on up to a straight angle of 180 degrees. The last thing that we're going to talk about is adjacent, complementary, supplementary, and vertical angles. An adjacent angle just means that an angle that is right next to another angle. So I can draw a picture of one angle here. Well, I'm going to draw another angle that's right next to that one. The angle on the top and the angle on the bottom are adjacent because they are right next to each other. But like I say, your teacher probably isn't going to give you full credit on the test if you just write right next to. So you have to come up with something a little bit better. Well, when we say the two angles are adjacent, that means the proper way of saying that is that they have one side in common. So whatever that side is, it could be a line segment, like I drew here, because remember, a line segment is something that's a certain length long, or it could be a ray. It starts at one point and goes off to infinity, or it could be a line, goes off into infinity in both directions. But whatever that is, two angles that are adjacent have one side in common, and they also have the same vertex. And remember, the vertex is that point. So two angles are adjacent if they have a vertex, if they have the same vertex, and they have one side that is the same. That is the definition of adjacent angles. Complementary and supplementary. Those are two words you're probably going to get mixed up because they mean kind of the same thing. Two angles are complementary if they add up to 90 degrees. So in this example I gave here, the two angles are complementary because the angle on the top and the angle on the bottom do add up to 90 degrees because they form a right angle. So those two happen to be complementary. They could still be adjacent even if they weren't complementary. But any two angles that add up to 90 degrees are complementary. So if they add up to a right angle. So if you, and there are always going to be two acute angles, you probably figured out. You don't need to know that. But two angles are complementary if they add up to 90 degrees. So complementary means they add up to 90 degrees. And your teacher will probably let you have it if you spell it wrong, but it's C-O-M-P-L-E-mentary, complementary. Compliment with an I means something, hey, you did a nice job on that. But it's spelled a little bit differently here. But I wouldn't worry about that too much. Complementary angles mean that they add up to 90 degrees. So these two angles, the angle on this side and the angle over here, those are complementary because they add up to a right angle. And we always show that a right angle is by drawing a little square in the corner like that. So a 45-degree angle and another 45-degree angle are complementary because 45 plus 45 equals 90. Or if we have a 40-degree angle and a 50-degree angle, they are complementary because that adds up to 90 degrees. Or a 60-degree angle and a 30-degree angle are complementary because they add up to 90. A 60-degree angle and a 60-degree angle are not complementary because they add up to something else. So all you need to know is that if angles are complementary, they add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary means that they add up to 180 degrees. And that means that they form a straight line, right? So a supplement, because remember, a straight line is the same as a 180-degree angle. A supplement supplementary angle equals 180 degrees. Supplementary angles equal 180 degrees. Yes, I have to show my units, 180. Now, how, for heaven's sake, are you going to remember that? Because those two words sound the same, and you're half the kids in your class are going to get them mixed up. Well, there are different tricks that you can use to memorize that. The trick that I like to use is, well, just put those two words in alphabetical order. Which comes first? Well, complementary comes first because it starts with a C. And supplementary comes last because it starts with an S. Well, then put the numbers in order, 90 and 180. 90 comes first and 180 comes second. So one way you can memorize that is just to remember that if you put them in alphabetical order, complementary and supplementary, then you're going to remember the answer. You're going to remember that complementary equals 90 and supplementary equals 180. The last word that you have to learn is vertical angles. And here's a word that it's used a little bit differently from maybe what you know, because you know the word vertical means straight up and down. Well, that's not what it means here. It means something else. Vertical angles are always formed whenever you have an X that looks like that. Well, you have two angles, one at the top and one at the bottom, and I'm going to draw a little arc in there to show that they are the two angles that we're talking about. Those two angles are vertical because they are formed by an X. So they are the angles formed by an X on either side of an X. So down here you have this angle, up here you have another angle. Those two angles are vertical angles because they form an X. Well, what about these two angles off to the side? Because we have another angle over here and over here. We have the two angles off to the side. Well, those are also vertical angles because they are both on the opposite side of the X. So vertical angles are angles that have the same vertex. That's why we call them vertical. They have the same vertex, that same sharp point in the middle. But they are, one is the extension of the other one off in the other direction. So whenever you have vertical angles, you are always going to have a diagram that looks like this X. But vertical does not mean that one is on top of the other necessarily. But, well, unless we turn the page like this, then one is on top of the other one and they are vertical. But vertical does not necessarily mean up and down. It means that they have the same vertex. And that is why they are called vertical angles. So that's what we get to the end of those definitions. I didn't tell you anything you didn't already know today, but I just gave you definitions of some terms that are used a little bit differently. Point, well, it probably means about the same thing that you thought the word point meant. Line means something different because anytime we have the word line, that means it extends off into infinity in both directions. A ray means something that starts at one point and goes off into infinity only in one direction. And a line segment is what you normally think of when you say the word line, just in everyday language. It means that you start at one point, you go in a straight line to another point, and then you have a line segment of a certain length. An angle has a vertex at the middle, the sharp point, and an angle is formed by two rays or by two lines or by two line segments. Normally you would think of it as being formed by two lines when you use your everyday language. You have one line up here and one line down at the bottom, and that forms an angle. But really, in this picture, I shouldn't say line, I should say line segment. And it can be lines or line segments or rays, as long as you get that vertex in the middle. That's what an angle is. There are, based on the size of the angle or how sharp it is, there are four different kinds of angles. A right angle means a square corner. An acute angle is sharp, and that means it's less than 90 degrees because a right angle is 90 degrees. But again, an acute angle is sharp, less than 90. An obtuse angle is not very sharp. It's more than 90 degrees, all the way on up to a straight angle. If the angle turns into a straight line, then it's a straight angle, and that means that the measure of that angle is exactly 180 degrees. The other terms we learned are an adjacent angle. That just means two angles that are right next to each other. but your teacher is not going to accept the words right next to. What you're going to have to say is that they have the vertex in common and they have one side in common. If you say that, you'll get that one right. Complementary angles mean that the angles add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary means that they add up to 180 degrees. And remember, you can remember that by putting them in alphabetical order. Complementary comes first, so therefore it means 90. Supplementary comes last, that means it's 180. And vertical angles are the two opposite angles formed by an X. So the top angle and the bottom angle are vertical angles, or also the side angle and the two on both sides, they are also vertical angles, even though they're not vertical. Well, you can make them vertical by turning the page. But vertical means that they have the same vertex and they go off in different directions. So I hope that clears up the misunderstanding, because this is very simple material. You knew what a point was before I started talking at you. But now you can use the same terminology that your teacher is using. So when your teacher starts talking about these concepts using this complicated terminology, well, you'll realize that what the teacher is actually talking about is actually pretty simple stuff that you already knew. So I hope by clearing up what some of this vocabulary means, we're going to make the subject a little bit easier. So please join us again as we continue this series of explanations of what your math really talks about. And you can find those videos as they come up by visiting our site at mathdoctor.net. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at mathdoctor.net.